40 below, and the only sound is wind finding every seam. Can a man crosses a frozen yard with an armful of split spruce, boots punching through crushed snow, breath turning to smoke before it clears his beard. Behind him, half buried in drift, sits a curved steel shell, no corners, no flat roof for the wind to fight. Just one long, unbroken arch sitting on 6 mud-caked tires, and a chassis built to carry weight nobody else wants to carry. Smoke pulls sideways off a flue cap. Inside, lamplight. Outside, a thermometer nailed to a fence post reads numbers most men have never seen in their life, and he doesn't even glance at it on his way through the door. That's the picture most people get wrong. They think a man living like that is running from something. He isn't. He's running the numbers, and the numbers told him to leave, because back where he came from, there's a different kind of cold. It shows up once a year in an envelope with a government return address, and it doesn't care if the roof needs work or the market dropped or the man inside lost his job in March. The property tax bill doesn't ask questions. It just asks for money. For $1,000, $6,000, $8,000 in some counties, for a house he already paid off 20 years ago, paid for in full, and still renting it back from the county every January, whether he likes it or not. Most men accept that as the cost of having a roof. They shouldn't, because there's a real legal distinction buried in how property gets classified, not invented by some online guru last week, not a trick, not a gray area, a distinction that's been sitting in tax code and DMV statute for decades, available to anyone who actually reads it. And a small number of men, mostly up here, have built their entire housing situation around it, not by hiding from the government, by using its own rules exactly the way they're written. I'm Jack. I've watched 2 of these bills go up from bare ground to finished, and I know men who are living them right now, tonight, in weather that would put most houses' heating bills into 4 digits a month. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not selling you a course. I've just watched this pattern enough times to tell you what works, what gets a man in trouble, and the one phone call that decides everything before he spends $1. Here's the part that should make every man watching this stop what he's doing. The shape on that trailer isn't decoration. It isn't some throwback design because it looks rugged on camera. That curved steel arch is doing 2 jobs at once. One with the snow on top of it, and one with a government that wants to tax it. And almost nobody connects those 2 jobs, because almost nobody bothers to ask why it's built the way it's built. Start with the snow, because it's the easy part. A flat roof collects weight. Every inch of snow that falls just sits there, pressing down, until either the roof gives or a man's up there every other day shoveling it off in the dark at 40 below, which nobody wants to do twice. A curved arch doesn't give snow anywhere to rest. It sheds away a slide, sheds a kid. There's no flat spot for the load to gather. So it just keeps moving until it's on the ground instead of on the roof. That's not luck. That's physics. The same physics that's kept Quonset huts standing through Alaskan winters since the military first welded them together 80 years ago to survive exactly this kind of weather. Most modern builders ignore it because flat walls are cheaper frame. Out here, cheaper frame doesn't matter if it's not still standing in March. But the roof shape isn't why this video exists. The chassis underneath it is. Here's the principle, and it's not complicated once somebody actually says out loud. The government doesn't tax things based on what they look like, or how comfortable they are, or how much a man loves living in one. It taxes things based on what they're legally classified as. A house bolted to a foundation, hooked permanently into water and sewer, sitting on land with a deed. That's real property. Real property gets assessed every year, and assessed property gets taxed every year forever, whether the value goes up or the man's income goes down. But a structure that's built on a rated trailer chassis, that keeps its axles, that's titled and registered to the state the same way a boat or a horse trailer is titled and registered, that's not real property in the eyes of the law. That's a vehicle. And vehicles get taxed completely differently, usually once at registration, and then with a flat annual fee instead of a rising annual bill tied to market value. Think about it like a uniform at a guard station. The guard doesn't know your name. He's not assessing your character. He's looking at what you're wearing. And a uniform tells him which line you stand in. A house wears a uniform of real property. A titled trailer wears a uniform of a vehicle. Same materials in some cases, same square footage, same stove keeping a man warm at night, completely different line at the gate. Because the paperwork says so, that's the entire trick. Not concealment. Classification. I want you to sit with that difference for a second, because it's the difference between something legal and something that gets a man in real trouble, and I'm going to come back to it more than once. Now here's the part that turns this from a curiosity into something worth building around. There's one state in this country where that classification advantage gets stacked with a second advantage most men have never even heard applies to housing. And that state is the one I happen to live in. Most of Alaska isn't inside what's called an organized borough. Boroughs are the state's version of counties, and only about a third of them actually levy a property tax at all. Everything outside those lines, the unorganized borough, which covers a massive share of the state's land, has no local property tax. None. Not a reduced rate. Not a deferred payment plan. Zero. Because there's no governing body in that territory set up to assess and collect one in the first place. Stack that with the fact that Alaska has no state income tax and no statewide sales tax. And you start to see why a man who classifies his housing correctly and sites in the right place can end up with a tax situation that looks almost unbelievable from the lower 48. Not because he's hiding anything, but because two separate legal facts happen to overlap in his favor. That's a promise. Not no taxes ever. A specific, large, recurring bill, the one tied to owning a structure, removed entirely, legally by classification and location working together. And here's the part almost nobody mentions when they talk about off-grid living, because it sounds boring next to the dollar figure. The mobility isn't a side benefit. It's protection. A man who can hook up his arch and move it is a man who's never trapped by a bad winter, a job that dries up, or land that stops working for him. The conventional house can't follow him anywhere. His can. So here's exactly what that build looks like, because I'm not going to dance around it. You start with a chassis, not a flatbed somebody welded together in a weekend. A properly rated trailer frame, multiple axles, 6 tires minimum at the build's any real size, because soft ground and spring breakup does not forgive 4 tires trying to do 6 tires work. You weld your steel arch panels directly to that frame, ribbed and overlapped the way the originals were built, because that ribbing is what gives a curve its strength against snow load, not just its shape. Inside, you're insulating heavy, spray foam, or rigid board between the ribs, because steel without insulation turns into a refrigerator at these temperatures just as fast as it turns into an oven in summer. Stove goes near the center, flue straight up to the highest point of the arch, because heat rises and you want every inch of that curve working for you, not against you. Most of these run on propane and solar both, with a generator backup for the stretch of winter, when daylight's down to a few hours and panels aren't pulling much. Water gets hauled and filtered, or melted from snow if it has to be. Toilets composting. Because a septic hookup is exactly the kind of permanent utility connection that starts making a county assessor ask questions you don't want asked. And then this is the step men skip, and it's the step that decides everything you title it. You register that chassis and shell through the state DMV the same way you'd register a horse trailer or a camper, get your VIN, get your paperwork, keep your registration current every renewal cycle without fail. That registration is a uniform. Skip it, and the most beautifully built arch in the state is just an unregistered structure sitting on somebody's land. And the county is free to look at it any way it wants. Here's where most men get it backwards, and it's worth slowing down for. The failure case isn't a bad Quonset. It's a good-looking fake one. A man builds a stick-frame tiny home, studs, drywall, the works, slaps on a trailer frame after the fact, calls it mobile, and assumes the title alone protects him. Counties have gotten wise to that move. There are documented cases of park model trailers sitting in one spot for years, hooked into permanent power and water, never moved an inch, and the county comes back and reclassifies the whole thing as real property, taxes it retroactively, sometimes years' worth at once. The chassis didn't save him. The chassis was a costume, and the assessor saw straight through it the moment somebody filed a complaint or drove past with a clipboard. The lesson isn't subtle. It has to actually function as a vehicle, capable of moving, not permanently fixed, not hardwired into ground like a house pretending to have wheels. Public land works the same way. Real but narrow, and a man who doesn't respect the narrow part loses the whole advantage. BLM land allows what's called dispersed camping, generally up to 14 days in any 28-day stretch. and then you move, often 25 miles or more, before that clock resets. That's not a loophole to live on one patch of ground forever. That's federal regulation written down, enforced when somebody decides to enforce it. Up here in Alaska, there's a small variance that matters to logistics. Unattended gear is allowed to sit for up to 12 months instead of the standard 10 days elsewhere, but that's a detail about leaving equipment behind, not permission to set up permanent residence on land that was never meant to hold one. Treat BLM land like a campsite rotation, the way it's actually written, and it's a legitimate tool. Treat it like a free homestead, and you're one complaint away from a removal order. And while we're naming things that sound bigger than they are, the permanent fund dividend. Every eligible Alaska resident gets one once a year, and depending on the year, it's run anywhere from around $1,000 to closer to $1,700. That is not a living wage. It's an offset, and it only means anything because a man's fixed costs are already close to zero. Treating it like income to build a budget around is how a man ends up disappointed in February. Treating it like a small annual bonus on top of an already low-cost structure is how it actually helps. Now, the boundary, and I want to say this plainly because I will not sugarcoat it the way some videos do. This is the one call I will not let you skip. Your own county or borough assessor's office, before a single weld, before a single dollar leaves your account. Call them. Ask directly how they classify a titled trailer-mounted structure on the parcel you're looking at. Get the answer in writing if they'll give it to you. Every jurisdiction handles this differently. What's true in one Alaska borough is not automatically true in another, and what's true in Alaska is absolutely not automatically true in your state. I have heard from men who assumed a video like this one was their legal confirmation, and it isn't. A video is a starting point. The assessor's letter is a confirmation. This is not tax evasion. I need you to hear that distinction clearly, because it's the entire video in one sentence. Evasion is hiding something that's legally taxable. Classification is building and registering something, so that it legally isn't the thing being taxed in the first place. One of those gets a man a fine, or worse. The other one is sitting in the tax code, waiting for anybody willing to read it. So who does this actually fit? A self-sufficient single man, comfortable doing his own repairs, comfortable with distance from a hospital or a grocery store, a remote worker with reliable satellite internet who doesn't need to be anywhere specific Monday through Friday, a veteran or a retiree who's already used isolation and doesn't need a neighbor checking in on him, a man willing to maintain his own systems, his own water, his own backup power, his own redundancy, because out here, nobody's coming to fix it for him on a Tuesday afternoon. And here's who should walk away from this entirely. A family that needs a school district. Anybody who needs a fixed, stable address for custody paperwork, for credit, for benefits eligibility. A moving structure and a flexible land situation can complicate exactly those things. Anybody risk-averse who doesn't want to learn basic mechanical maintenance. And honestly, anybody who's listening to this video as a substitute for calling their own county. It isn't one. It was never built to be one. I'll be straight with you about the limit, because pretending this removes every cost would make me no different than the people selling overpriced courses on this exact subject. This does not remove registration fees. It does not remove insurance. And insurance is its own headache here. A lot of standard policies aren't built for a steel arch on a trailer chassis, and a man has to shop specifically for coverage that understands what he's actually got. Sometimes paying more for less coverage than a conventional homeowner gets without trying. It does not remove fuel costs or maintenance or the income tax he still owes on whatever he earns, wherever he earns it. It does not work identically in every state. Some have already closed versions of this gap as park model and tiny home living got more visible, and what works today in one county can get tightened next budget cycle. It does not protect a man who lets his registration lapse, who ignores his chassis weight rating, who hooks into permanent utilities, and then acts surprised when the county notices. And it does not make him invisible. He still exists, on paper, everywhere else he has financial ties. This removes one specific, large, recurring bill. It does not remove the man's obligations to the rest of the system. Upkeep matters as much as the build itself, maybe more. Registration renews on a schedule. And missing that window is how a man finds his advantage gone overnight. Weight ratings need rechecking any time something gets added. a second stove, extra water storage, a heavier battery bank. Because the rating on the chassis doesn't move just because the load did. Spring road weight restrictions are not a footnote up here. Plenty of roads post reduced limits during breakup specifically because the ground underneath can't support what it could in January, and a man who ignores that timing can find his rig stuck, fined, or both. Insurance needs revisiting every renewal because coverage for unconventional structures shifts faster than people expect. And the classification itself isn't permanent just because it was correct once. A man should check back in with his county every so often and confirm the rules haven't quietly changed underneath him. None of this makes the conventional system a scam. I want to be fair about that, because it's not. A traditional mortgage, a permanent foundation, a hookup to municipal water and sewer, that buys real things. Predictability, convenience, a bank willing to lend against it, a neighborhood with services close by. The system sells stability, and for a lot of men, that stability is genuinely worth the price. The problem isn't that the system is dishonest. The problem is that almost nobody sits down and actually calculates what that stability costs over 30 years against what it would cost to build something different and classify it correctly from day one. And here's the part that should sting a little. This same principle, that taxation follows legal classification, not appearance, isn't some secret men discovered. Corporations and wealthy property owners use exactly this logic all the time. Structuring how assets are titled and held specifically to land on the more favorable side of the line. Nobody calls that a scheme when a company does it. It's just called good structuring. This video is the same idea, just scaled down to one man, one chassis, one steel arch, and one county assessor's office willing to put the answer in writing. So here's the whole thing again, short. A structure that's titled and registered as a vehicle isn't taxed the way a house is taxed. Build that structure as a properly rated, welded steel arch on a real chassis, not a tiny home dressed up to look mobile, and register correctly. Cite it where the law already works in your favor. Verify directly with that jurisdiction, not assumed from video. Respect the rotation rules if you're using public land instead of your own. Respect the weight ratings. Keep the registration current. And before any of it, make the one call that tells you exactly where you stand. Do that, and a man can legally remove one of the largest recurring bills most people accept as permanent. Skip any one of those steps, and the advantage disappears the moment a county decides to look closely. Tell me where you're at and what you found out. If you called your own assessor's office, I want to know what they told you. Every county answers this differently, and the more of you who share what you actually learned, the more useful this gets for the next man trying to figure out his own situation. Now, knowing all of that, here's the trap waiting on the other side of this video. A man hears titled steel arch, properly rated chassis, gets excited, and buys the first Quonset kit he finds online. And that single decision is exactly how most of these builds go wrong before the first weld even happens. Wrong gauge steel, wrong chassis compatibility, a kit price for a Flatlander's mild winter instead of a real one. There's a video up on screen right now walking through exactly which Quonset builds are worth the money, and which ones will leave a man with a beautiful shell sitting on a chassis that was never built to carry it. Watch that one next, before you spend a single dollar on steel, because the system isn't hiding any of this from you. It's not some locked vault only a few men have the key to. It's sitting right there in tax code and DMV statute, written in plain language, available to anyone willing to read it carefully and make one phone call before they build. The system isn't betting that you can't find the exit. It's betting you won't bother looking for the door in the first place to